This is Jeremy Wentworth-Stanley. I'm the fellow who has a hyphen in my name. The hyphen is silent, but I am anything but that. Respectonomics is bringing you this edition of Living Dignity. Living Dignity is the phase that we offer by Respectonomics, that explains and talks about, addresses some of the issues that are within our own domain that we can think about in terms of our own production, our potential, dealing with some of the fears that we encounter. It's more of an analysis of our own humanity. My name is Jeremy Wentworth-Stanley. I am the voice of Respectonomics, your voice of Respectonomics, your year of Respectonomics. And as we have said in other podcasts, whether it's on Living Economics or Living Journey, we do ask that you provide feedback. And also, if you would like the opportunity then for us to be providing you with workshop material, presentation, speeches, and so on. What we're talking about here is, and this is called the distribution of power. And I think most of us think of distribution of power as an opportunity or not an opportunity, but rather the reality of how power is distributed. And the distribution we're talking about resides in everybody's home. It's in every apartment building. It's in every condominium. It's actually everywhere. And that is the hydro panel. Now, the hydro panel is usually hidden away in the basement. It's not usually something that you would invite people to come and have a look at and say, do come and have a look at my hydro panel. But it is one of the most important mechanical features of one's living space, one's lifestyle, because the hydro comes into the house, the big power comes in, it then goes into the panel, and the panel is then able to distribute the electricity, the hydro, to wherever it may be needed. So you can have hydro going to the kitchen, hydro going to the bathrooms, hydro going to the living rooms, and so on. And it's a distribution center. It also ties into the amount of power that is needed in those individual circuits. So you'll actually notice that they've got different numbers on the breakers. The breakers are like a fuse. And these breakers will open and close depending on the draw that's on them. If the draw is too big, well, that circuit breaker will open up and the current stops going through to whatever it is. We don't need to get into a huge discussion of the flows of electricity. We don't need to talk about Faraday and Newton and Marconi and things like people like that. What we want to do is to look at two concepts or three concepts here. One is that the panel, the hydro panel, is a place of distribution. If you think about it, if the power that came into the house was somehow literally tied into one appliance or one aspect of one's living, that thing would likely explode. If you took all the electricity and said, right, we're going to pump it into the refrigerator would go on a mad burst and then stop. So it's not only is it a distribution animal, but it's also a measuring device and also as a way of governing the flow of the current. As much as one may know that, we probably don't talk about it very often. A lot of people haven't even looked at their panels. They do when one of the circuit breakers opens up. But generally speaking, people do not look at their hydro panel. And that in itself is an important part, because what we're looking at in the scheme of humanity is we as human beings, we get power that comes from a combination of nature, from the combination of the spiritual, what would you call it? The spiritual overthrow in our lives, that sense that something is bigger than us, and it comes into our lives, and our lives are to do with distributing that power. Now, you think about it for a minute. If we agree that the panel doesn't get a lot of viewscape, a lot of people aren't looking at it, it may be true that the same goes for our souls, that inner being that is in actual fact our own hydro panel. It's the panel that distributes the power that we believe comes from something bigger than us. And that may sound a little bit sort of, airy-fairy, soft underbelly, doesn't really have concrete information. But you would hardly dispose of your control panel, your hydro panel, and say, well, I can't see it. I don't really think about it very much. Therefore, it's not important. It is important. And the hydro panel equivalent, the metaphor, is the panel that is within each and every one of us, and we commonly call it the soul. So you've got the power that comes into the soul, and the soul then distributes the power to the parts of the body, to the mind and the body itself, as required and as needed, and as we draw on it. But here's a couple of thoughts for you. One of the things is, if we agree that the soul is this hydro panel, then we also need to agree that it needs to have power. And the power is something that you and we will determine extraordinarily personally under the heading of freedom of choice, freedom of selection. And if you think about it, in a hydro panel, we think in terms of fossil fuels, nuclear power, renewables, hydro, as in rivers and reservoirs and dams and this kind of thing. So there are different ways in which the power can be created. And we can do the same thing in our lives and say, how do we develop that power that comes into our soul? We know that that power is fundamentally a product of or an issue of faith. But if that faith that comes into your soul is the one that provides the power, you would know it and you would agree with it and you would use it to your advantage. But think just rather like the hydro panel, we don't really pay a lot of attention to it. The flip side is that when things go wrong, we most certainly pay attention to it. And in fact, preventatively, it's even better to look at it before the circuit breakers go. So we want to be able to look at our souls and to look at the source of our faith. For some people, that faith lies in nature, others in humanism, other in materialism, divinity, the headship of God. There can be different ways in which we can assess how that power is developed, just like we look at the different kinds of sources of power into the hydro panel. And then we look at what is the most effective power that we can obtain, and to think about then the faith in that power, which of course is the breeding ground for the power to come into our lives. And that said, therefore, we look at faith as being the sort of the fuel for the power, and therefore that is where presumably most of us want to be fully powered at all times. We want our bodies to be in good gear. We want our minds to be particularly in good gear. And therefore we look to our souls to be that reservoir of power, to be that hydro panel. We recognize that this soul, our soul, is doing an extraordinarily important job, because not only is it distributing the power, but it effectively allows the power, or rather prevents the power, from building up into one place only. You remember, if we draw too much on a particular circuit, the circuit breaker will go. And it's the same with our arrangements with our souls and with our faith. If we draw too much on our faith into one area of our being, then there's a good chance that the circuit breaker will stop, it will open, and we will have to reconnect. And this is really so we've talked a bit about the source of the power, and which power, which faith that we believe is going to create and enable this power to be distributed in our being. But there's one other thing about a hydro panel. If you ever talk to the electricians about the problems with these panels, you'll often find that one of the biggest risks you have is fire, which of course is, do I have to say it, extremely destructive. But here's the catch. So many times when we see these fires and we see the sparks and we see the arcs of electricity and so on, it's because the connection hasn't been made properly. It hasn't been tightened down. So the message is this: select the faith, select the power, recognize that it's in your soul, which becomes your governor, which is the one that distributes the power to the rest of your being. And not only that, then, we need to make sure that all the connections are secure and tight. That is an obligation, a responsibility of each and every one of us. Because when that connection it goes loose, or if it goes loose, the difficulty is that's when we get the sparks. That's when you get these what they call electrical arcs. Not only that, but as that difficulty emerges, as you get these sparks and so on, it also builds up resistance. So, in other words, we find that the power that would be coming through to us becomes obstructed or impeded. And therefore, because this connection is loose and it gets aggravated when the connection then starts sparking. So, in our lives, one of the creeds is one of the most important things to do is to consider your soul. And when you've considered the faith that you believe and your freedom of choice allows you to believe that that's the faith that applies to your soul, then make sure that you have metaphorically a screwdriver and a wrench that really tightens it down so that you can then know that that is your faith. You can acknowledge it. You can acknowledge its conviction. You can acknowledge your commitment to that faith. And then you can look at this power that is then able, unimpededly and openly, able to move into all other parts of your being. And your other parts of being, not only the physicality of your body, but also the entire being when we think in terms of our mental capacity, when we think of our conscience, when we think of our intuition, when we think of our perceptions, we want those to be fueled to the best. So therefore, bring the soul to the as a electrical panel, as a hydro panel, make sure that all the circuit breakers are closed, meaning the connections are there, make sure the connections are tight, and build a faith that allows this power to flow freely and powerfully within your being. Classically, at the end of these discussions, we say, I rest my case, but I ask a question. When did you last check your internal hydro panel? This is Jeremy Wentworth-Stanley, your voice of Respectonomics. Please go to the website or go to our email, jeremy@respectonomics.com, with your thoughts and your questions, your what you would like us to do, preferences, and any other subjects along these lines of how we restore the dignity of the human being and bring back all that full capacity for which we were individually and collectively intended. Thank you so much for listening.